So, the main agenda of this session is to understand how we as youth or as stakeholders in general engage with multilateral environmental agreements that are under UNEP, and how we can establish mechanisms in more MEAs in an effective manner, and how we can improve the existing youth engagement that we already have in MEAs. So, Mr. Balakrishna and Dr. Georgina, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today. Uh, on behalf of the Children and Youth Mage Group, I'm really excited and I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us today. So, to start off, uh, I understand that both of you engage with stakeholders in your daily jobs, right? So, can you tell us a little bit more about the best practices, what you think are the best practices of youth engagement and stakeholder engagement mechanisms in the various multilateral environmental agreements that you've looked at up till date? What makes these particular stakeholder engagement mechanisms stand out to you? And how effective do you think these stakeholder engagement mechanisms are? We'd love to hear from the both of you.
Thank you. Very, very good morning, colleagues, friends. Glad to be here, the second day of the Youth Assembly. Very glad to see the interest and so many of you joining us for this particular session. I don't know how many of you were yesterday at a session on science policy interfaces in the morning, where I just mentioned that for a large number of stakeholder groups, including the youth, if you are not on the table, then you will be on the menu. So certainly participation, meaningful provision of inputs into a number of these processes are extremely critical and important. But of course, the focus of this particular session is on multilateral environmental agreements. I'm sure all of you are familiar with what the multilateral environmental agreements are. These are global agreements that are negotiated, adopted, ratified by the member states, focusing on very, very specific objectives that are guided by the mandates provided to them by the member states. And for those of you who are relatively new to this area of work on multilateral environmental agreements, I'll just sort of spend less than a minute to give you a bit of a background on the evolution of the agreements. Now, currently, if you take biodiversity, nature conservation, there are varied estimates of numbers of these multilateral agreements that are currently in operation, more than 500. Several of them are global, several of them are regional, and some of them are also bilateral. But when these agreements were initially discussed, a lot of the discussions were very, very specific, thematic, sector focused. 1974, we had CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, focusing on a very, very specific component of how to ensure that there is no illegal trade in wildlife, both flora and fauna. But since then, the discussions on multilateral environmental agreements started expanding both in their focus, scope, and objectives. And of course, a landmark year was 1992, when we had the Rio Earth Summit, or the UN Conference on Environment and Development, where we had countries adopt 3 global agreements, one focusing on climate change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. Very specific, very focused. But over a period of time, for those of you who follow either environmental law or governance-related discussions, you would have realized that the focus of these discussions have started to expand. And if you look at the outcomes of the 2022 15th meeting of Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is all-encompassing. It's just not about biodiversity. It speaks about climate change. It speaks about trade. It speaks about pollution. It speaks about consumption. It speaks about fairness and equity. It speaks about financing. So what's now happening is that the focus of these agreements are getting broader and broader. And for anyone to participate meaningfully in these discussions, one of the first and fundamental requirements nowadays is to have what we call as a kaleidoscopic view of some of these issues. You can no longer work only on a small sectoral issue of a particular environmental problem and can contribute to some of these discussions because the discussions have become broader and overarching. So what is required is to have broader understanding. No one expects that everybody becomes an expert in pollution, climate change, biodiversity, consumption, trade, equity, ethics, human rights all in one go. But it's very important for us or for you to understand how some of these issues link to the discussions, decision-making processes at the global level. So that's the first point. The second point is by nature, the multilateral environmental agreements, decisions are global, but the responsibility for implementation is national. So it is at the country level, the parties to the convention are parties to the protocols, being parties have a duty to implement the decisions that are made. So translating the global decision into national implementation plans, the member states always look for larger participation from different stakeholder groups for implementation. So that's what we call as spreading the ownership of implementation. And youth actually form a very, very important part of that particular constituency. So in other words, the responsibility of implementation to an extent is also spread to stakeholder groups like the youth. So the question is, if you want to effectively participate in these discussions and debates, you have two choices. The first choice is to follow the agenda. What is being discussed, what is being said, and how these discussions are shaping up. Or the second option is, to an extent, influence or set the agenda. So to a certain extent, the discussions in these fora, like the Youth Assembly, are not only to understand where things are, what the specific requirements of these discussions are, but remember, a number of these processes are set in terms of their agenda setting quite long in time. We just concluded the 2020, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework adopted in 2022, and we are now running towards 2030 to achieve the objectives of the framework. But then a lot of people who work on what is called the foresight planning for some of these processes, I'm sure will start thinking post-2030 already. So what is important, in as much as you broaden your idea, broaden your understanding and scope of these environmental processes or MEAs, it is important that you also participate effectively in a bit of that foresight discussion. And yesterday, I don't know how many of you, but some of you probably would have participated in that discussion on foresight. Whereas UNEP, we are trying to push and promote the science policy interface related work on the foresight process. The third element of it is, how can you be effective in participation? There are two ways to be effective, again. One, to actually take the floor, provide your inputs, provide your comments, but to also contribute to an extent, not setting the agenda, but contributing to the agenda. If you look at the experience, for example, I don't know how many of you are a part of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network that actively participated in providing inputs into the 2022's Global Biodiversity Framework process. The planning and discussions related to youth contribution to the framework started many, many years in advance. So it is very important that your participation is not just on the current issues, but it has to be a little anticipatory as well. Having said that, not all MEAs engage with youth or have a mandate to engage with the youth in the same spirit or in the same form and structure. Each of the MEA, as decided by the member states, who actually are the ones to make decisions in the processes, decide on the nature and the timing of youth engagement. We have had some of the MEA processes where the youth engagement has been consistent and had matured significantly over the last number of years. But we do have some MEAs where such engagement is just beginning to happen. A case in point is the decision of the last COP, Conference of Parties, to the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, even though the convention existed from 1974 onwards. But for the first time, they decided that there should be a meaningful youth participation in the decision-making process. So you actually are, to an extent, in a bit of an opportune time, where you can contribute to processes that are fairly mature, but you also can contribute to processes that are just beginning to emerge, that is beginning to happen. So what is important is for you to look at how the discussions, how the decision-making processes emerge, but also to actually anticipate some of the agenda that is going to be emerging in the years to come in terms of your contribution. And that's where for some of us who are a part of these processes, both supporting the decision-making process and the implementation process, we always find that it is a little challenging if you already have an agenda set, if you already have some elements of the agenda that is provided where you can only provide some inputs and comments, rather than you trying to actually foresee and set some priorities and say that these are the priorities for the youth well in advance. So for that to happen, first thing is to engage. Second is to ensure that you understand the different processes, because today there is no one MEA which is disconnected from any or some other multilateral process. Today, everything is interconnected. You can't discuss MEAs without discussing sustainable development goals. You can't discuss sustainable development goals without discussing financing. You can't discuss all of it without discussing human rights. So to an extent, there is an interconnected or transdisciplinarity to the discussions that have started to happen. And it is really maturing extremely fast. But one big advantage I see for you to participate in these processes is that you actually are a part of this process because you have a passion. You have an interest. A lot of you come, not all of you are from environmental background or having a degree or a focus on environmental sciences. Some of you are focusing on management, some of you focus on law, some of you focus on finance, management, a number of different disciplines. But what brings you together to this particular framework or into the platform is your passion. And that is something which is going to be extremely important as we move forward, because we just want, in as much as the technical competence to move forward the processes, but we want that passionate participation in these processes, because that is what is going to make that change. And even yesterday I mentioned about the need for natural sciences, social sciences linkages. And if this is one passion, if this passion is the one that is going to make that change at the level of behaviors of individuals, I think we'll really go a long way in achieving our objectives of successful, not just negotiations and decision-making processes of these MEAs, but also implementation of these MEAs. So with that, I wish you good luck. And if you have any specific questions, we'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Lovely to see you all again today. So the question of really how youth can effectively engage with MEAs, I think first of all, we need to look back to what is the foundation of this engagement, the foundation of engagement in multilateral processes. And it's good to know this foundation, because then you can recall it in certain discussions or other platforms. So we look to Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, the 1992 Rio Declaration, which really looks to access to information, public participation, access to justice. We then, of course, look bit further along at Rio +20, paragraph 88 of the outcome document, which explicitly called for active participation of all relevant stakeholders, drawing on best practices and models from relevant multilateral institutions and exploring new mechanisms to promote transparency and the effective engagement of civil society. The Rio +20 outcome document calls for strengthened public participation. It also recalls the importance of access to justice and access to information in environmental matters for all stakeholders and undertaken in partnership. You all know, of course, by being here, that UNEP takes the approach of the 9 major groups, which were outlined in Chapter 27 of Agenda 21. So one of those key major groups, of course, is children and youth. So setting aside that foundation, we can then look at what are the ways to engage. And I think it's important to break this down into 2 ways. And Bala spoke about both of them. But the first is supporting implementation. So you have the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. And of course, these can be global MEAs, they can be regional MEAs. And depending on where you're based, you may wish to engage either in sectoral MEAs. I mean, there are some people that really engage with the biodiversity MEAs, others that really focus on the chemicals and waste MEAs, for example, or you might wish to engage in across MEAs within your specific region or area. So that's the first one, supporting implementation. The second is the engagement in the process itself. Okay, so I'm going to talk to both of these. If we look at supporting implementation, we then look at the areas of cooperation and partnerships with MEAs. Often the multilateral environmental agreement secretariats will have within their websites sections on partnerships and collaboration. And these are further reinforced by the strategic plans of the MEAs. So you can look into the strategic plans and see where they really emphasize a multi-stakeholder approach to implementation. Taking some examples, we can look at the CBD, which actually has very well-developed stakeholder engagement, including for children and youth. And they have that set out in Goal 4 of the strategic plan of the CBD. And they have a specific objective, 4.4, which says key actors and stakeholders, including private sector, are engaged in partnership to implement the convention and are integrating biodiversity concerns into their relevant sectoral and cross-sectoral plans, programs, and policies. There are other examples of this, and they actually do specify children and youth as one of those partners. CITES has Goal 5 of their strategic vision. But actually, under CITES, they don't explicitly reference children and youth. As Bala said, for CITES, it has fairly recently emerged as a resolution within their Conference of the Parties. But they do speak more to UN agencies, to NGOs, and others. Ramsar has it set out within paragraph 42 of their strategic plan. So you can look into these documents within the secretariats of the MEAs, look to the partnerships and cooperation sections of the relevant websites. So that's to support implementation. And also reinforcing what Bala said, implementation happens at the national level typically. It is implementing those obligations of states parties under the conventions. So also important for you to really understand what those obligations are. Understand the domestic legislation that seeks to implement those obligations at the national level. Understand who the delegated authorities are, who have the obligation to then meet those at the national level, and work with them. So moving on to the second part, which is the engagement in the process itself, the decision-making process. And here we look perhaps not only to the MEAs, but also to the international scientific bodies or panels such as IPBES, IPCC, and the forthcoming panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution, because those are also important multilateral processes. Typically, in the process of an MEA, you would participate as observers. And Observers in meetings, including the conference of the parties, the COP, the meeting of the parties, the MOP, depending on the MEA, and as well as other oversight mechanisms like the standing committees, as well as the technical and scientific bodies under the MEAs. So think about all of these different processes. You may not want to just follow the COP or the MOP, but also look to those scientific body processes as well. To understand your participation as an observer in these processes, we have to look to the rules of procedure under the MEAs. So again, MEA Secretariat websites will have the rules of procedure listed there. Go into the rules of procedure and look at the clauses outlining observers. Quite often, these are very similar across the MEAs, the clauses on observers. They typically outline the right to be present as an observer, but not to vote. So I'll give you an example from the CMS, from the Conference on the Migratory Species. It sets out under the rules of procedure that any body or agency technically qualified in protection, conservation, and management of migratory species, which is either A, an international agency or body, either governmental or non-governmental, or a national government agency or body, or B, a national non-governmental agency or body that has been approved for this purpose by the state in which it is located, that has informed the Secretariat of the Convention of its desire to be represented in the meeting by observers, shall be permitted to be represented unless 1/3 of the parties present object. Once admitted, these observers shall have the right to participate, but not to vote. And you'll find very similar clauses across rules of procedure. So you do have then the right to have a representative present at sessions of the committees and the plenary sessions, and the right typically to contribute to discussions as observers after all of the state's parties have exhausted their interventions. So there is a typical protocol for participation in these sessions, which if you've participated, you will notice. Sometimes under the rules of procedure, it also allows observers to circulate documents. However, these are often not included in the formal documents of the meeting. If an observer wishes to input text or others, they would have to do so through a state's party, through a member state under that agreement. So there are limitations to participation as an observer. And it's, again, very important to understand what those limitations and opportunities are. We also should look to the resolutions that are passed under the conferences of the parties or the MOPs. And Bala mentioned one under CITES, but another example is COP14 of Ramsar just passed a resolution. It's resolution 14.12 on strengthening Ramsar connections with youth, or through youth rather. And it also references other similar MEA decisions. So again, we've got decision 11/8 of the CBD, which encourages parties to include youth fully in relevant processes. There is decision 13.9 of the CMS, which promotes integration of youth groups into convention processes. There's also resolution 17.5 of CITES, which is the one Bala mentioned, which encourages parties to explore opportunities to engage youth with the convention and include youth delegates in official delegations of states parties. So more and more, you're getting these resolutions specifically directed at youth participation within multilateral environmental agreement processes. So go and look for those resolutions because they are your entry point. They are your hook. And they are also a way that you can reach out to your member state delegations and say, hey, look, there's a resolution that says you should include a youth delegate in your official delegation of the country. So we really think you should implement this. The last thing I want to say is that often accreditation is a prerequisite for participation as an observer within these MEA processes. So again, even if there is not a formal accreditation process, at minimum, there is an obligation to inform the Secretariat of the Convention of the desire to be an observer a set period of time prior to the COP or the MOP. Sometimes this is like 9 weeks in advance. Sometimes it depends on the various rules of procedure. But this was mentioned yesterday at the opening session. Accreditation is not that hard. There are barriers, there are issues in terms of official official status of an NGO at the national level or at the international level, but look into accreditation because it is quite an important step in order to gain that observer status. So I think those are the key things that I wanted to share in terms of participation, both in implementation of MEAs, as well as participation within the process of MEAs at either the global or the regional level, depending on the scope of the MEA. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you so much, Mr. Balakrishna and Dr. Georgina. I think I can safely speak on behalf of everyone when I say that everything you shared with us today was extremely insightful. So just a very quick and a brief follow-up question that I have to the both of you. So one thing that all of us here in the panel here from the youth of today, whenever we interact with them in order to collect policy inputs, is the fact that most of us seem to experience a disconnect when it comes to policy advocacy or our engagement into policy inputs itself. We believe that some of us are burnt out, and we believe that there is no effectiveness in the policy inputs that we give. So we want to hear from you a very few encouraging words, if possible, about how effective you've seen our inputs or stakeholder inputs be in multilateral environment agreements up to date.
Okay, so here I think we have to differentiate between youth inputs to policy development at the national level and youth inputs to decision-making processes under an MEA, which are legal processes. This is under international law. So while you may have states parties developing policy instruments that would support their achievement of obligations under an MEA, I think we need to sort of clarify those differences, right? So are we talking about the effectiveness of youth advocacy in domestic policy instruments, or are we talking more about the effectiveness of youth voices in global multilateral decision-making under the passing of resolutions? And I think there are good success stories of both. I mean, we had a very effective youth forum prior to the regional ministerial conference that was held in Asia Pacific last year. Zohair was leading it together with a number of people from the Asia Pacific. The youth statement that came out of that was echoed in member state statements numerous times, and it was very clearly articulated or referenced, or some of the key messages in it were referenced in the summary document of the meeting. And I think you can see, while it may not directly say that this was put forward by the major group on children and youth, because typically for it to be reflected, it should come through a member state. So I think one of the key ways in which you can ensure successful advocacy is to have allies. Develop that ally network within the member state delegations. Also, just having those platforms and spaces. I mean, there's a really important side event, right, during UNEA. That's a wonderful platform in which you can make member state delegations aware of the priorities and the key messages of youth. And then some of those member state delegations may take up those messages and reflect it in their high-level statements within the forum. That's really a very effective approach.
Thank you, Georgina. I think very, very key points you mentioned. Just to add to that, the decision-making process or the conference of parties comes at the end of a journey. And there are a number of building blocks that actually contribute to the decision-making process. And what is important in order to find some space in that final decision-making process is to also contribute to a number of these building blocks. For example, if you take the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are ad hoc working groups, there are expert group meetings, there are technical groups meetings that are held. Then they have the scientific body meetings. Then they have regional consultations and workshops. So essentially, the documentation or the decision-making that happens at a COP is a reflection of the outcomes of a number of these processes. So in as much as it is important that you participate in the COP meetings or in the governing body meetings, it is important that you also keep your eyes and ears open to a number of these building blocks that happen, contributing to that particular text that gets discussed, negotiated, and decided. And for that, the fundamental requirement is to be consistently present and also ensure that the voice is heard through an appropriate fora. Georgina mentioned about the side events. They're extremely important because remember, in a formal meeting of negotiation, your ability to contribute will not be more than 2 minutes or 3 minutes. But if you are a part of a number of side events to present your ideas, to present your priorities, you do have more time and the participants more amenable to actually listen, make an attempt to understand and reflect so that they find the recommendations or the ideas find a place in the process. So what is important is, in as much as you prepare and focus on these big apex meetings, it is important that you also focus on a number of these participatory, the preparatory meetings, and a lot of it start at the national level. And your contribution, to an extent which to me is a weak point in that particular process, is even the national process, even the national consultations or preparatory processes are not essentially informed of the local priorities or the sub-national priorities. And that is where your voice can be best heard and your priorities can be best reflected. So 2 points: consistent participation and ensuring that you keep your eyes and ears open for a number of processes that are leading to that particular decision-making process through the governing body or the conference of parties. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the both of you. Both your insights were really helpful, and I'm sure that everybody here has something to take back with us about how we can more effectively engage with all the MAs that are under YEA. So I'll be moving on to our next panelist for today, who is Shannon. Shannon, can you very briefly give us an idea about how you, as our sister constituency, try to engage in very unique ways with all the MAs that you are under?
Sure. Thank you, Aish. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon. I'm the global focal point of the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform. And this past year, we've built up youth engagement and sent the first youth delegations to several major processes in the UN Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution pillar. The Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata conventions, so each of the 4 chemicals MEAs, as well as another deeply connected forum, the International Conference on Chemicals Management, where youth directly negotiated the text of a new global framework on chemicals. So our work in this is built on a foundation of the principles of youth engagement. And this was a collectively consulted document created for youth by youth within the major group for children and youth. So let's walk through what these principles, or what we believe the core of meaningful youth engagement is. 1, that it's self-organized. So in the context of engagements, this implies autonomy and being free from outside control or pressure. Each group of young people can and will decide the best structure and working style for them based on their interests and their capacities. So this is independent and youth-led. 2, that it's legally mandated and rights-based. So it's imperative to engage in any initiative and avenue where youth rights are formally enshrined as a requirement within its rules of procedures or its modalities. And this directly speaks to Dr. Lloyd's reference of the Rio Declaration and the rules of procedures across the MEAs. 3, that it's designated. So young people should not be made to compete with other stakeholders, parties, or groups for space in the process of engagement. There should be specific designated and reserved seats for children and youth made available and mechanisms in which they engage. 4, well-resourced engagement is a right, and young people should not have to spend out of their own pockets for the realization of this right. Arranging the budget for the engagement of young people should be the obligation of the engaging entity or entities. And finally, 5, that youth engagement is accountable. So to ensure for engagement to be far-reaching and to not just be limited within the room of a conference and then forgotten about afterwards, the respective engagement structures should have built-in accountability, reporting, and feedback mechanisms towards a constituency of young people. So maybe to go a little bit beyond this further and sort of address a broader question on what does youth participation actually mean for the MEAs? How does it go beyond just being a seat in the room and actually contribute to more innovative and effective policies within the MEAs? So we think to increase the effectiveness of the conventions, it's actually strategic for the parties in the room and the secretariats to hear directly from those most impacted, so that policy and action can be prioritized for issues that deliver the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of human health and the environment. So to reiterate, we believe that those who are at the greatest risk and the most harmed by an issue or issues upon which decisions are being made not only deserve to have their voices heard, but that their involvement makes for more effective policies and outcomes. One of the initial ways by which this can be built up further in the MEAs is to see it specifically reflected in documents to ensure that the principles of meaningful youth engagement are embedded in the activities undertaken by the conventions and their secretariats. Across the MEAs, as we've heard, there's quite a patchwork in terms of how they engage civil society and by extension, youth participation. You know, for example, again, the Aarhus Convention actually allows members of the public to bring allegations of non-compliance directly against party states, so quite a high level of power there. But many others have significant gaps in a defined civil society or youth engagement strategy. And we talked a bit about youth references in Ramsar and CITES and others. And the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform has also looked at how youth are referenced across the chemicals MEAs. The Stockholm Convention text explicitly references that parties consult with, quote, groups involved in the health of children in Article 7, and children's right to access information related to their health and environmental effects in Article 10. Now, Basel and Rotterdam conventions indirectly cover these issues, but they do not currently include the words children or youth in their text. Other technical assistance programs and guidance documents, such as the FAO's Hazardous Child Labor in Agriculture Awareness Raising Program, are steps in the right direction. And these are all great opportunities to further build on this progress. One thing that we proposed within BRS is for a children and youth action plan to be developed by the BRS Secretariat, modeled after an existing gender action plan within BRS. So let us empower young people as not only, quote, seats in the room, but real partners towards achieving the objectives of the MEAs.
So our last panelist for today is someone joining us online. His name is Clarence, who's from Philippines. So Clarence is the thematic focal point for our Clean Air and Ocean Working Group. So Clarence is here to highlight one of the biggest achievements of CYMG this year, our participation in MOB 35. So ever since For the first time since the introduction of the Montreal Protocol, the CYMG was invited to engage with that particular instrument. So Clarence, in a very short video, is going to explain how we as a constituency had a very successful example of engagement.
Well, first of all, CMG has been very active in the different MEA processes. Even some of the youth constituencies were created. Like, for instance, we engaged even when the CWYP was created. Even before that, the previous leadership actually engaged in the different MEA governing body sessions. And then the most interesting thing is that the CWYP was actually created from one of the very youth environment sessions, an online session. We all together actually worked for that, and it was a very successful intervention so far. And now the CWYP is engaged in the different MES, which has been a very successful story where we don't have particular mechanism. As Georgie and Balakrishna was saying, like perhaps in different MES, we don't have a structured stakeholder engagement mechanism, but it's also possible that we can create a platform and we can engage. And CWIP has been a very successful model for different MES. Also, plans will be, I think, highlighting about the youth engagement in the Montreal Protocol, where we engaged in the history of 35 years. Young people were invited as observers to that protocol. And we're looking forward to have a youth forum on climate protection and Montreal Protocol later in this year in Bangkok, right before the COP13 of Vienna Convention on MOP36. Also, CMG is engaged in the CMS and CITES process. Back in the last COP13 of the CMS, CYMG was invited to provide inputs as an observer, and then our previous focal point actually engaged in the India COP of the CMS. And also in CITES, we have previously had some example of collaboration for different webinars and meetings. But yeah, again, I mean, there's obviously the landscape of stakeholders in different processes. It depends on how the stakeholders are referenced in the bodies, but also we are pushing for creating new mechanisms. Also for this time, in this very year, we are going to discuss about Ocean Science and Governance Youth Network that we are going to launch soon after the Youth Environment Assembly, which will focus on facilitating youth engagement in different regional seas conventions. We have found that in the regional seas convention, we have very limited youth engagement, but those agreements actually play a very important role in protecting our pristine ocean. And in the future plastics agreement, there's obviously a connection between the regional seas program and the future plastics agreement. So obviously as CYMG, we will provide inputs to the processes. And even for the INC process, which is going to give birth to a new MEA, we have collaborated with CWYP and other sister constituencies, and we have created a mechanism for engaging in the INC process, which is the Global Youth Coalition on Plastic Pollution. Again, I understand we talked more about like how young people are engaged in the MEAs and how they are referenced, but I think it's very important that young people are also engaging in the national deliberations of these MEAs. For instance, about like there are a lot of these MEAs actually, they have their own national plans. But in most of the time, we find that in preparation of this national plan, young people are not engaged meaningfully in the national context. So I think we should give this message to the member states from these Youth Environment Assembly and from any future youth forums in different MEAs and other environmental processes, that young people should also be engaged in the formulation of the National Action Plan or National Implementation Plan, whatever it is called. and also the science policy interfaces and the financial mechanisms, which has a huge impact on the implementation of MES. We as CYMG is now collaborating with the JEF. JEF is one of the contributors to this Global Youth and Movement Assembly, and we look forward to working with them, in future to providing inputs in the financial decision making for different MES and environmental processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zuhair. I think that condenses all of the engagement that we have been carrying over for the past few years. Now I think we can move to Clarence's video highlighting our engagement in Montreal Protocol.
Unfortunately, I cannot join you. Hello, everyone.
All right, then I think we can just circulate the video amongst our networks.
Yeah.
Or Zuhair, would you like to say a few words about our engagement in the Montreal Protocol?
I think I've already mentioned a bit about the Montreal Protocol. I mean, after Gibbon and I started, we actually tried to find out which are the spaces we have that we don't have any youth engagement. We found that ozone is a very important one. I mean, I know that ozone protocols are very successful. I mean, they're the most successful. We refer to them in different processes. But there's a new instrument in the ozone protocol, I mean, the Montreal Protocol, which is called Kigali Amendment, and which has a huge potentiality to contribute in limiting the global warming. And we found that, yeah, we need to bring young people's focus on these protocol, and especially the Kigali Amendment, which talks about, phasing out the HFCs, hydrofluorocarbon, which are not perhaps the ozone depleting substances, but if it's controlled, the production of consumption of these substances, then it will contribute significantly to the work of Paris Agreement. We know that how the discussions are happening on Paris Agreement and what is the so far achievement on the Paris Agreement. So we need to find out another ways where we have deadlock in one process to meaningfully contribute to our shared environmental goals. And from that thought, we started connecting with the Ozone Secretariat. And then it's worth noting that for the ozone, there is no such reference to the major groups or constituencies. Neither it's like very open to the NGOs like other MES. But we worked with the secretariat and we managed to get, like, at the very last moment, 5 young people getting accredited as official observers to the ozone protocol. And we were invited to deliver the final statement in the closing session, where we talked about how the Kigali Amendment can, support us protecting our future and, limit the global warming. Also, in the last MOP 35, right here in this room, and then other rooms, obviously, we were actually allowed to organize an official youth side event of the MOP 35, where we engaged with the member states and other entities. We discussed about meaningful engagement of young people in the ozone protocol, not just in the process, maybe the governing body sessions or MOP 35 COP, not just in those big meetings, but also throughout the process, how we can engage in the national level, in the regional level, and in the expert groups meetings. And we are now working on that to, further improve the youth engagement in this process. Especially, we look forward, as I said, to organize a youth forum on climate protection and Montreal Protocol in Bangkok. Yep, I'll just keep it to that.
Thank you so much, Zuhair. So to wrap up the session, we have our last speaker of the day, Olga, who has something very exciting to announce on behalf of our constituency. Olga, please take over.
Uh, Thank you for this insightful session. And I think it laid a great foundation for my next announcement. So if we can pull up the slide, the presentation with the last slide. Maria, can we pull up the presentation with the last slide? We want to announce the research on youth engagement in different MEAs. And this research, basically the purpose so the purpose of this research is to gather youth inputs on their engagement in different MEAs processes and science policy interfaces. And this research would consist of two pillars. First pillar is to get their insights from you as young individuals of how you engaged in different unit processes. And this survey asks whether you have such an experience and whether you would like to contribute to be interviewed by our research team. Then we will look into all the rules of procedures and all the resolutions that were mentioned today to gather official references of how each MEA engage with young people, what are the best practices and what are the gaps. And we will create a roadmap for you as part of the CYMG of how you can engage in different MEAs processes and science policy interfaces. And science policy interfaces, it's different science policy panels like GEO, IPES, IPCC, and IRP, International Resource Panel. So if you would like to contribute to the research, please scan the QR codes and follow the questions, whether you want to be interviewed by the research team or whether you would like to join the research team. And to join the research team, you need to have some sort of prior experience in doing research and be able to dedicate a certain amount of hours to look through all those regulations and resolutions. And it will be a bit tedious because you need to, the websites of MEAs are not that user-friendly, some of them, so it would require some time and dedication. So please, if you feel that you would like to join, just approach me after the session and I will tell you more about the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga. So that brings us to the end of our session today. I would like to once again thank our panelists, especially Mr. Balakrishna and Dr. Georgina, for joining us today. I really believe that everything that you shared with us today was extremely insightful. And all of us in the audience today are going to take back something with us about effective youth engagement. I hope and I thank every one of you for joining us today. And I hope that all of you do take back something with you from this session. That's it from my side. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for coming, guys. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I am happy that you were there. And unfortunately, I cannot join you there in person because I'm currently in a field training. That's why I'm in the in the forests here in Philippines, specifically in Cordillera. So please also mind the dusts because it's very dusty here in the forest. So thanks again, Joshua, for inviting me and on behalf of the constituency to talk about the Montreal Protocol, specifically on the 35th meeting of parties, that it was the first time that the Ozone Secretariat invited young representatives, youth representatives to discuss something at the table. I'm excited to talk about something awesome today, how young people specifically our representatives rocked the House at the 35th meeting of parties. You know, that's a big deal. You know, that's a big deal where countries get together to save the ozone layer, and as they pronounce that Montreal Protocol is the most successful multilateral environmental agreements ever. So guess what? This time, young folks like us get a seat to the table. I would like to express sincere gratitude to the Ozone Secretariat, and they made it happen. Now, let me break down why it's such a big deal. Usually, these meetings are all about technicalities, the science, as well as making resolutions, policy making, and other relevant matters. But this time, young people had a say. We brought fresh ideas, passion, and energy to the table. Imagine this: young people from all over the world sharing their thoughts on how to protect the ozone layer. We already discussed about cool stuff such as technology, green energy, and why it's crucial for us to act now. And you know what? Our voices should be heard loud and clear. The decision makers should have listened to what we had to say, and they should take our ideas and turn them into actions. That's success right there. It shows that no matter how old you are, you can make a difference. Our involvement proves that the future is bright and we are not just the leaders of tomorrow. So, as in different youth forums, youth conferences, youth activities, we are leaders right now. So, let's keep rocking the boat, making waves, and showing the world what young people can do. Together, we can protect our planet and make sure there's a bright future for generations to come. Once again, I enjoy you at this moment in this session, and I am very proud to be with the people who I've worked with in the past few months and to be working with. I hope that we can further engage to the Montreal Protocol as we have plans for this year towards the 36th meeting of the Montreal Protocol, the meeting of parties, and to the Vienna Convention. We are excited to announce you soon the plans for that. And I hope that other working groups relevant to ozone layer, clean air and ozone working group, I hope that we can work together and we can work further. Like once again, I would like to thank everyone here and enjoy staying in Nairobi. And I hope you had a good UNEA.
Well, we would like to thank Clarence. Because of that, of course, he couldn't join in person or online YEA. So we are really thankful for Clarence's engagement. Of course, we feel his presence here, of course, has been engaged for a long time. He also was in the planning of this year and the previous Youth Environment Assembly in 2022. He was part of the team as well. So we really thank you, Clarence, for that. Now we're gonna set the stage for the next consultation. We're gonna have a really nice topic right now. It's gonna be about the plastics zero draft of the next legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the environment, in the marine environment. So I am welcoming on the stage the facilitators of the next session. We're gonna have this session for the next 2 hours. And we're gonna have in the next room another event that is about to start on youth environmental human rights defenders, and that's only half an hour, so that we can, of course, engage in the discussion. This is gonna be a little technical, a little fruitful, and this consultation is the ending of a previous consultations we have had and roundtables we have had on the plastic pollution revised zero draft. So, yep, I'm gonna give it to Kartik. who is there, who is going to be moderating this session. So thank you very much. This session will try to end this session by 12:50 before lunchtime. Thank you very much.
Dear all, I'm a bit late in announcing it because I was a bit caught by surprise by the early ending of the previous session. But Georgina Lloyd in the previous session mentioned clearly the Principle 10, Rio Principle 10, as an important tool of all your engagement and our engagement. And that reminded me then almost 10 years ago, our unit, the civil society unit, then called the Major Groups and Stakeholders branch in UNEP, had actually published and worked in a multi-stakeholder approach, this implementation guide, which is a truly multi-stakeholder result of research on the Rio Principle 10, and it's a clear implementation guide on the principle, and has been also developed together with member states, NGOs, and a lot of major groups, and led by one of our major groups facilitating committee members back in the day, who is still active. So we produced hard copies. We still have some in English and Spanish. But of course, it's available online. So you can just type in implementation guide, Rio Principle 10, and you will find a PDF copy downloadable in English and Spanish. Sorry for taking that time for from the next panel, but I hope you will find it useful. If you do need a hard copy and you don't find it anymore at the end of the room where Alejandro is right now, please do let me know and we can get you one. But they're heavy. Thank you.
Bye.